Hey, it's all with another video, brought to you by these wonderful people, and I had a small in making this too. Today I want to slow down from the latest dealings with the World of Warcraft and take one of those rare trips into the past with 10 things about Vanilla WoW. 5 things I miss, and 5 things that I don't miss. Classic WoW is coming soon, and it's got plenty of people excited. So I'm going to share a few thoughts from the ancient days as a day 1 player. This is important to say, but this is a personal video full of just opinions based on my own experience in the game, which is different from most because, well, my first adventures in Azeroth were spent largely as a solo player. So maybe I didn't appreciate WoW back then the way that I could have, or you could just say I played the game wrong, I'm not going to fight you there, oh well. But let's get into what I miss about Vanilla. I miss there being downtime. Once upon a time, going through the motions of leveling or otherwise venturing out into the world of WoW was very formulaic. It was an unconscious calculation to approach this group of enemies before you and then pull one at a time until your health or mana got low, and then you'd eat for a few seconds and get right back into it. The routine, of course, was different for each of the classes and specs. So as a warlock, I'd sick my Voidwalker pet on the enemy, throw a few dots, maybe one Shadow Bolt, and then wand until about 20% health, I think, and then pull the next enemy, repeat, maybe add a life tap, maybe a fear if I pulled more mobs, and maybe use a health stone if I needed it, and then once I was at 50% health, I'd rest for a bit while I calculated my next move. It's as if the outdoor world was a series of puzzles where I had to measure my pull rate against how quickly I'd consume mana or health. Then add in the chaos of mobs who ran away at low health, jackasses mob training, and a little bit of PvP, and hey, we have a game. With Wrath of the Lich King came several big changes in WoW, among them a big class revamp that gave struggling classes and roles a very powerful toolkit. That's been refined numerous times over the expansions, and today, pretty much every class is self-sufficient. The bar for pulling multiple mobs without feeling like you're in danger has gone way up. It feels less like a traditional MMO and more like Diablo or Dynasty Warriors, with how well we can mow down the enemy even while they're beating our faces in. There's plenty of back and forth debate over this though. In the progressive story of the World of Warcraft, our characters have seen one conflict after another, brought down demons and gods alike, so it's fully expected that we can pull a bunch of snake men without having to be a frost mage, right? But there's a line that I think that's been crossed where the monotony of downtime has turned into the monotony of mindlessly wiping out the enemies of the outdoor world. And the attempts to alleviate this with things like item level scaling have been met with a lot of skepticism, even backlash. Some would say that they miss when the world felt dangerous. Downtime might not be what this sums up to, but it is a big component of what these players meant. I miss not seeing players stress over flight. Since Wrath of the Lich King, there was a hanging question that would always come. When would we be able to use our flying mounts? And this question would continually be asked until we finally got it. I don't want to throw out the conversation though, because flying is here, flying is more than likely staying in some way, shape, or form, and I have my own misgivings about it, but I just miss the days when flying wasn't really given a second thought because it never existed. Flight was left to the flight masters and our imaginations. Back then, we just put up with climbing that volcano in Ungoro or clawing our way out of Searing Gorge. We fell off plateaus and not cliffs. And there were no conversations of players wanting to be rewarded for completing content by being able to ignore the dangers of the world. There were complaints, sure, but not the whole giveth and taketh away kind of complaints because the giveth hadn't happened yet. I think some of us have gotten a little bit spoiled on the conveniences available to us these days. The portals, the teleports, and flight whistles, and of course flight. Vanilla just felt simpler then. I miss having most of our abilities baseline. Talents did a really good job of one thing. It made baseline abilities stand out from each other to make them effective, where without said talent points being pumped into them, they would not. I'm sure that there were a few maniacs who were totally fine with Corruption having a 1-second cast time to it, but I was not one of them. Having all of these abilities that may or may not be viable without talents help define our characters from a roleplay perspective. Modern WoW celebrates the difference between classes with arguably more abilities at the expense of them being available only under certain conditions, such as having a certain specialization or participating in PvP. I think it would do players a big favor to have more abilities be available baseline with varied effectiveness based on your spec. Meanwhile, other abilities can have some universal utility, but are clearly meant to be viable in PvP. I miss the days when quest text was actually important. Part of it was that the World of Warcraft's topography was a lot more simple back then. It was easier to get to the places quests told you to go, mostly because they actually told you where to go, and directions on how to get there, either directly or through not-so-subtle hints and landmarks. These days, quests use less descriptive words and instead pinpoint on the map exactly where objectives are located. From a roleplay and discovery perspective, I'm a little bit put off. I prefer the journey of discovery and figuring stuff out, and not with my eyes locked on a map or relying on the game to light a beacon. You could argue, but Soul, you dingus, you can just turn off those trackers and play the way that you always did. So in that case, I would just rather see the quest tracking be off by default. Using trackers, add-ons, or Wowhead ought to be a choice and not the default setting that the world is created around. Not all quests are treated this way, but I do consider it a little bit lazy that there are quite a few quests that aren't descriptive or immersive because they're built with quest tracking in mind, and I think that sucks. World quests are especially offensive in this regard. I miss World PvP. I remember the first day the honor system was implemented in vanilla. I logged on and I happened to be in Terran Mill, and it took a good minute or two to just load the skeletons on the ground. I managed to hide in a small shack and just kept using Rain of Fire just outside before I died to some other AoE effect, which was probably Arcane Explosion. But in the meantime, my honor kills started piling up just from that. It's not necessarily that which I miss, but more like the simplicity of World PvP in WoW. It's like, hey, there's the enemy faction. Kill them because the game lets you, but you could also choose not to. Even the early battlegrounds started killing off the sense of World PvP because by their nature they're instanced. Every bloodthirsty player in a battleground meant one less bloodthirsty player out in South Shore. I do like what battlegrounds offer because it makes PvP into a game. It's just that there's a feeling when PvPing in the outdoor world that it's not just a game of snatching flags or scoring points, but to assert yourself to the enemy faction, to occupy their space and cause some friction. There's plenty more to miss and I encourage you to share your thoughts, but now let's get to what I don't miss about vanilla WoW. I don't miss the PvP grind. Dungeons or raids weren't very appealing to me, and it would be years until I found out why, but I enjoyed World PvP because it felt fairly natural. It wasn't tainted by game systems, at least not until it was, and this was still during vanilla. PvP went through all sorts of weirdness while it got its footing. Battlegrounds took people away from the field. Dishonorable kills discouraged wiping out towns or flight masters, which mostly meant griefing lobbies, and that's the right thing to do, but tagging NPCs as civilians in a game where accidental AoE is pretty easy, that made attacking towns super frustrating. The honor reward system in vanilla had a pretty solid calculation where more time spent PvPing meant less sleep, and that's what it took to nail High Warlord or Grand Marshal. Those goals were well beyond my willpower, but in my opinion, I think that they were just really punishing. You may have heard me talk about suggestions for Battle for Azeroth for a simple weekly leaderboard that simply pointed out who were the most bloodthirsty players for that week, and that's it. Just the top score for bragging rights. I don't think PvP in the non-competitive space is in a good place today, but in WoW's earliest days, it was rough enough that I'm glad that there isn't a system today that encourages that overly grindy sort of behavior. I don't miss endgame being exclusive to grouping. Like I said earlier, I played through vanilla solo, which many of you could successfully argue that I played the game wrong, and I don't blame you. I missed out on dungeons and raids, and any elite quest that I couldn't chain fear myself out of. I potentially missed out on all of those awesome stories that would come out of those experiences, which helped to solidify the legend of vanilla WoW's experience. Endgame back then compelled you very strongly towards these activities. It was as clear as seeing the dungeon or raid tag next to a quest. Raid or die is a phrase that's still used in arguments today. But that sort of format was what people were used to back in the days. You could say that it was glamorous to be part of that big team, downing that giant boss, and getting some super epic pieces of loot. There wasn't anything wrong with that, but what sucked is that almost everything was behind that 40-person wall. Take the epic quests for hunters and priests, for example. These were difficult and fulfilling single-player challenges that rewarded an exceptionally powerful weapon for their class, and yet in order to complete this single-player challenge, you had to go through the slog of completing Molten Core. Now, consider Legion, and several challenges that had nothing to do with being forced into a group. The Deaths of Chromie scenario, Withered Training, and the infamous Mage Tower celebrated our accomplishments, but there were still enticing group incentives like Mythic Plus and the ever-present raid scene. In WoW's current expansion, it's unfortunate that there's a lack of single-player challenges, at least as of this date, but since vanilla, additional long-term goals are acknowledged by the game, whether you play in a group or if you're alone. Collection UIs such as achievements, mounts, pets, and transmog fill this gap. For better or worse, more players are acknowledged for the content that they like to do. There are multiple definitions of endgame, and I appreciate that. I don't miss talent trees. There were a lot of role-playing games that I played where you had multiple and parallel progression paths. For example, one for your level, and one for skills that you can level up. When I first started playing in the WoW beta, this is what I expected, which tells you a little bit of what I expected in an MMORPG. In vanilla, yeah, there were ranks for abilities, but these were tied directly to your level and not some parallel progression path. Focusing on talents, I did not like that I can go down one talent tree, but then pay some NPC to kind of turn the clock back, and then go down a different talent tree the same distance without having actually played through that tree. I mean, where's the roleplay of leveling as a DPS and then switching to tanking? I often observe the following argument for the old talent system where each level that you gain, you get a talent point, so it always felt like you were earning something. That's totally fair, but I just saw it differently. I mean, yeah, we worked towards obtaining talent points, but it wasn't actually work towards developing our specs. I guess what I'm trying to say is that WoW might have been a better experience if instead we chose a talent to level up, but we also had to earn experience to unlock that said talent and then use an available talent point to make that selection. It would feel extremely grindy for sure, which is one reason why Blizzard didn't go this route. But to me, this feels like a more dedicated investment into the characters that we play. Don't get me wrong though, I'm not happy with how talents are today either, but I just wouldn't consider Vanilla's talent system to be demonstrably better. I don't miss the pain of leveling alts in Vanilla. I had a lot of real-life friends who played WoW back in 04, many of them on different servers, and pretty much all of them were Alliance. But I wanted to play with them anyway, so between enjoying my Horde main, it was a game of trying to level up as fast as possible so I can maybe do some dungeons with them, because I wasn't big on doing dungeons back then or now, whatever. Especially in Vanilla, with dozens of zones to choose from, it took a while before I had my own path to leveling, a usual routine to follow to make the process as painless as possible, if there was such a thing. I was way past the phase of discovery and wonder, and I was pretty much at the come on hurry up so I can have a good spot in dungeons phase. I don't disagree that there's something lost like 15 years later with the expansions and the faster leveling and the stat squishes and the scaling, but I wouldn't want it to take weeks or months for someone to grind their way through 7 expansions worth of quests. Heirlooms are for people who need it. Once upon a time, that was me. I don't miss all the damn walking. One of the best pieces of technology to come out of Wrath of the Lich King was phasing, to see the world change a little bit according to the quest that you completed. Even today, it's still rough on some edges, where sometimes players can't see each other, but one of its great strengths is that it allowed NPCs to be placed dynamically. It felt really good to have a bunch of turn-ins at your local quest hub, but it would often be a pain in the ass too to walk all the way back to your original destination. Phasing has allowed for the world to feel a little bit more alive, because after completing an objective, there's that quest giver over there, who is now much closer to give a follow-up, decreasing the amount of time spent walking and increasing the amount of time spent playing. Today, there's a better balance between walking and phasing to give Blizzard a lot more flexibility in the story and quest flow. Multiple fetch quests in vanilla across entire continents today would make a really good case against ActBliz increasing subscription time because of all the damn walk-in. So I look forward to seeing comments from players who experience this for the very first time. So that wraps up 10 things that I miss and don't miss about vanilla WoW. Thanks for going on this short trip down memory lane, and feel free to share your own praises or misgivings. Don't forget to support the channel because you are awesome, and I'll see you next time. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, and stay breezy.